So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Detroit Lions video. Now, the other day, we talked about a very early prediction of the Detroit Lions 53-man roster on the offensive side of the ball. We took some creative liberties. We played some players that might not end up making the roster, took some risks on players that might end up beating out veterans to make this 53-man roster. And today, I wanted to do the same thing for the defensive side of the ball as well as the special teams. Now, this video is going to be a little bit longer, as today we're going to be covering the defensive side of the ball, of course, but then we're also going to be covering special teams as well as a 16-player practice squad of guys that I don't think are going to quite make the roster, but guys that I think the Lions are going to very much want to keep around in case of emergency, in case of call-up, or just to have as competition at practice throughout the weeks. So, with that being said, and without any further ado, let's get right on into taking a look at the Detroit Lions' early prediction for their 53-man roster on the defense and the special team, starting off with the edge rushers. Now, I think that the edge rushers are a very interesting group on the Detroit Lions. Obviously, we have a lot of players that I think are very much chalked up to make the roster, very much chalked up to get playing time, but it's really hard to tell what players are going to play more than others, as well as which players are going to have which roles. Now, I can say with confidence that Romeo Okwara, that Aiden Hutchinson, James Houston, Romeo Okwara, John Kaminsky, and Josh Pascal will all make the roster. I think very confidently, at the minimum, those 5 guys will be Detroit Lions come week 1 versus the Kansas City Chiefs. And I would assume that they're all going to play a role in that week 1 matchup as they all try to get Mahomes tackled in the backfield. But I also think that Charles Harris is going to end up making the roster. Last season, the Detroit Lions went into the NFL year with 6 edge rushers versus the Philadelphia Eagles. And I think that's what they go in this year. Obviously, Aiden Hutchinson, your first round pick from a season ago, the second in voting for Defensive Rookie of the Year, led all rookies in sacks, was phenomenal, was incredibly productive. He is going to make the roster. James Houston, the late season breakout, second in rookie sacks last season, is going to make the roster pretty undoubtedly. Romeo Okwara, I think coming off that torn Achilles, really showed some good signs after coming back in the final 6 weeks, had 2 sacks in his last 6 games, and was looking pretty good as a rotational guy getting back under his feet. John Kaminsky just re-signed a brand new contract with the Detroit Lions that will keep him in Detroit for 2 more seasons. Guaranteed he's going to make the roster. Josh Pascal, former top 50 pick from 2 drafts ago, didn't really play much as a rookie because of injury as well as the other rookies playing over him, but he had a couple flashy moments of his own, and a lot of people, including defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn, believe that Josh Pascal can be a great player on the defensive line. And then I think Charles Harris is going to beat out Julian Okwara for that final edge rusher position. I think that Charles Harris has shown a little bit more over the last couple of years. He's been relatively more healthy over the last couple of seasons, and even going back to 2021, Charles Harris was the Lions' best edge rusher. If he now becomes the Detroit Lions edge rusher 6, I think that shows how much depth that this team has, as well as keeping genuinely a very quality edge rusher in Charles Harris for a relatively cheap contract. And I think that he beats out Julian because the Lions coaching staff has no ties to Julian Okwara, right? He's been a flashy player. He's made a couple of big plays for sure throughout the last couple of seasons, but they're not tied to him, right? They haven't drafted him like they have they didn't draft Charles Harris, but they did sign him, and actually signed him twice in the time that Julian Okwara has been with the Detroit Lions. I think they have more connection with Charles Harris, and they really don't have a loyalty to Julian Okwara other than the fact that he is a member of the team right now. Now, moving on to the interior defensive line, this one, I again based it much like last season. Last year, the Detroit Lions carried 5 defensive linemen into the regular season. And I think the 5 this year are going to be Aleem McNeil, who's returning and is probably going to be playing more of a pass rush 3-tech role. Isaiah Buggs, who I think is going to play more of a 3-tech role, kind of alongside Aleem McNeil. I think that they're both going to be pass rushers and both going to be players that play a lot. Broderick Martin, I think, is going to be the more prototypical nose tackle, lined up directly over the center, eating up blocks, being just a big human in the way of the running game, essentially. Then I think Christian Covington, the veteran defensive tackle, is going to make the roster as well, bringing a little bit more of that veteran presence, a little bit more of that experience to the locker room that has a lot of young players. And then I think Benito Jones played very well last season in an underrated role. And I think he will make it as well. He is a player that last year was kind of flying under the radar. A lot of Lions fans probably didn't even know he was on the team or on the field at certain points, but he's a guy that made a lot of plays, and he's a guy that made a lot of defensive stands for the Detroit Lions over the 2022 season. And I think he's going to make the roster pretty easily. Now, moving on to the linebackers, I think the Lions are going to go pretty light at linebacker, go very similarly to what they did a season ago. Alex Anzalone, a lock to make the roster. Jack Campbell, a lock to make the roster, the first-round pick out of Iowa, who's been reportedly playing pretty well at camp. Malcolm Rodriguez, the sixth-round standout from a season ago, as well as Derek Barnes, a fourth-round player who the Lions coaching staff as well as teammates have a lot of high praise for this offseason as a player that's continuing to play very well throughout OTAs and minicamp, and a player that's earning starting reps all the way back in June. Now, I do think Jalen Reeves-Maybin will be more of a special teams player, will take on the Chris Board role, a player that has experience on the defense, has experience starting as a defensive player, but is going to be primarily a special teams ace, a player that's going to probably captain the special teams, if nothing else, as well as just kind of be that glue guy on the linebacking core that's been here before, that knows the defense pretty well, that could start in a pinch on the defensive side of the ball, but is really going to be most of his value is going to come from the special teams. Linebackers, I think, is pretty chalked up. It's a position that I think a lot of people know what's going to happen, and a lot of people know what players are going to be there. But again, like the defensive line, I think the roles are going to be very interesting. Who's going to play on early downs? Who's going to play on passing downs? Who's going to play on the goal line or in between the 20s and the red zone? I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to see how the Lions rotate these linebackers, because I genuinely think the top 4 all might share very similar snap counts depending on what role the defense needs them to play any given week. Now, moving on to the cornerbacks in the secondary, I think the Detroit Lions carry 5 corners into the season. That being Cam Sutton, Emmanuel Mosley, if he's healthy, Jerry Jacobs, Ifeatu Melifonwu, who I believe will play a mix of cornerback and safety, but I think will play more cornerback than anything, as well as Starling Thomas IV. Now, Cam Sutton, of course, being the prized free agency get, Emmanuel Mosley being another free agent that is coming in over from the San Francisco 49ers, Jerry Jacobs being the best returning cornerback from a season ago, Ifeatu Melifonwu, a former third-round selection who's played both corner and safety, as well as Starling Thomas, the undrafted free agent who could add a lot of special teams value, as well as a slot cornerback or a boundary cornerback if you really need. Now, starting off with Cam Sutton, I think he's going to be a boundary cornerback. I think he's primarily going to be the Lions cornerback 1. If not, it's going to be Emmanuel Mosley. Emmanuel Mosley, I think, has the more prototypical build for cornerback 1. I think he has more experience on the boundary versus X-wide receivers. So I wouldn't be surprised if Emmanuel Mosley ends up playing the cornerback 1 role, shadowing X-wide receivers, guys like DK Metcalf, guys like DJ Moore or Justin Jefferson, because I think he has a little bit more experience on the boundary with those things. Now, I think Jerry Jacobs and Cam Sutton are going to flip between who's in the slot and who's on the boundary, but both of them can play both roles very, very well, and I think it'll be a fun cornerback trio to watch. Ifeatu Melifonwu is a player that has struggled to stay healthy over the last couple of years, but if you hear Dan Campbell talk about him in press conferences, you're going to know that he thinks very highly of Ifeatu Melifonwu and probably is going to give him a role in the defense, if nothing else, as a hybrid corner safety, a very similar role to what Will Harris has been playing for the Detroit Lions over the last couple of seasons. And then again, I think Starling Thomas brings the most special teams value of every cornerback on the roster right now. I think he has 4.2 speed, which is really going to help him with special teams as well as make the roster and stand out athletically, as well as him really showing out the last couple days of OTAs as we kind of have a break between now and training camp. Starling Thomas has a good taste in the mouth of all the coaches as he finished OTAs very, very strongly. Now, moving on to the safeties, I think the Lions are going to bring 4 safeties, into the regular season, that being Tracy Walker, Kirby Joseph, CJ Gardner-Johnson, as well as Brian Branch. Now, the safeties, I think, are the easiest position to figure out, right? Tracy Walker, a team captain, returning to the Detroit Lions after a torn Achilles, is going to be ready and was medically cleared for training camp. Kirby Joseph, rookie standout, led the team in interceptions, was a great player his rookie season, looks to be even better in OTAs and minicamp this year. CJ Gardner-Johnson, a prized free agency possession. Last piece of this free agency market for the Detroit Lions will come in be a starting safety or a starting slot cornerback for the Detroit Lions, but will be on the field regardless a ton for the Lions this season. And then Brian Branch, the 45th overall pick in the 2023 NFL Draft, a hybrid corner safety linebacker from the University of Alabama, elite instincts, playing very well at minicamp and OTAs. There's no way he doesn't end up making the roster as well. But unfortunately, that does kick out some guys like Brandon Joseph, Brady Breeze, as well as a couple other young safeties that the Lions have been relying on over the last couple of years. But I do think those players are eventually going to return elsewhere on this roster. Now, finishing off the active roster, the special teams is pretty easy to figure out. Jack Fox is going to be the punter. He's the only punter at camp. He's the only punter the Detroit Lions have had since Brad Holmes has taken over the job. McQuaid, the free agent from the Dallas Cowboys, the Pro Bowl long snapper, is going to make it. I think will beat out Scott Daly. And then I think Parker Romo, maybe a little bit of a surprise on the special teams, is going to beat out both Riley Patterson as well as Michael Badgley for the starting kicking job. It seems like he has a little bit more leg than those two, is a little bit more consistent so far than those two. And from the XFL and on, and even going back to college, he's been a very consistent kicker. Although I do think the Detroit Lions potentially keep a second kicker on the practice squad. So with that being said, that is my 53-man defense and special teams, but I do think the Lions are going to keep quite a few interesting players on the special teams, and I do want to take a look at that first. Now, the special teams rules are a little bit confusing in the NFL. Not everything is, I think I got it correct. I think I followed all the rules exactly how I understood them, but the special teams might not be perfect as far as the rules of eligibility, but I do think going through all the rules, these players do fit the criteria. These players do fit the criteria and are eligible for the practice squad. Now, I have a couple veterans on the practice squad. I think Will Harris and Julian Okwara, if they make it through waivers, are players the Detroit Lions will want to keep on the roster, but as of right now, probably aren't good enough to compete or at least make the active roster spot as of right now. As I said, Will Harris is a player the Lions continue to like, continue to re-sign, continue to bring back, but I think that the thing that gives him the biggest boost on this roster is his versatility. And now the Lions have a ton of cornerbacks that are versatile. They have a ton of safety slot corner mixes. They have a lot of players that can play multiple positions in the secondary, and they all play that position better than Will Harris. Julian Okwara is an athletic outside linebacker edge rusher, but he's kind of a lesser version of what James Houston's bringing. He's kind of a lesser version of what some of the other outside linebackers are bringing, and I really don't think he's going to make the roster just due to the fact that he struggles to stay healthy, as well as just hasn't been as productive as some of the other edge rushers on this roster. Now, Anthony Pittman has been on the practice squad the last couple of years. He's a player the Lions really like for special teams. He's a player the Lions really like in the preseason, but just isn't going to probably make the roster and beat out the other 5 linebackers that the Lions already have. Now, Shane Zylstra is a player that has taken first-team reps with the Detroit Lions offense this offseason, but as I said the other day with the tight ends, I think that, Sam Laporta is going to make the roster. I think that James Mitchell is going to make the roster. And I think that Brock Wright's going to make the roster. And I don't think you really need to carry 4 tight ends, especially considering that most teams probably aren't going to look at Shane Zylstra too closely. And they're going to be able to stash him on the practice squad and bring him up every week if they need him as that 4th tight end, as you're able to elevate 1 player a week. Now, Riley Patterson, the kicker the Lions just traded for from the Jacksonville Jaguars, I think will be the backup plan, right? If Parker Romo goes into the regular season and isn't quite playing as high and isn't quite playing at as high of a level as the Lions wanted him to, Riley Patterson is a reliable kicker within 40 yards. He's a player the Lions can call up. He's a player the Lions can rely on and fall back on. And he's a player that if he does make it through waivers, I think will end up on the Detroit Lions practice squad. Jamar Jefferson, the now 3rd-year running back from Oregon State, is a player that just continues to be a good preseason player, be a good practice squad player, be a good OTA mini camp, training camp guy, and just never seems to find his way onto the active roster. I think the Lions have a lot of talent at running back now. I just don't think Jamar Jefferson fits on the active roster. Same thing with Chase Lucas, a guy that I think could be called up every single week, but a guy that I just don't think is going to make the active roster because, quite frankly, a lot of the other cornerbacks the Lions have brought in are better football players. And then Brady Breeze, a player that's been a practice squad guy for a couple of years, is probably going to remain on the practice squad as well. However, that's only half the practice squad, as I do think the Lions are going to keep a lot of young players and a lot of rookies. Brandon Joseph, the UDFA from Notre Dame, a player that has led college football in interceptions, a player that has 10 interceptions over the last 3 seasons, and a ball hawk in the secondary, is a guy I think the Lions are going to want to keep on the practice squad. Corey Durden, the defensive tackle from NC State, a guy that could be a pass rusher, could be a developmental starter one day. I think will also stay on the roster if he makes it through waivers. Stephen Gilmore, a player from Marshall, I think the most underrated UDFA on this entire roster, could end up pushing for a starting spot on this team, or at least a roster spot on this team, beating out potentially Ifeatu Melifonwu or Starling Thomas the fourth for that last cornerback spot. But I do think because of the special teams role, Starling Thomas will make it over him. Obini Izzy, I think, will be a depth offensive lineman, much like he was last year. Dylan Drummond, the OTA standout, the rookie minicamp standout, I don't think has a role on this roster right now, but I do think will make the practice squad and could get called up in the weeks that Jameson Williams is missing, or if injuries continue to arise in the wide receiving core. Connor Galvin, the offensive tackle from Baylor, I think will make it in a very similar position to Obini Izzy last year. Nowaske Traver, I think will make it as a UDFA linebacker, and then I think Chris Smith will make it as a UDFA defensive lineman from Notre Dame. All of these players, I think, have a lot of upside. All of these players are relatively young. All of these players, I think, could eventually be called up or developed into players that make the roster, that start on this roster. And I do think that Brandon Joseph, Stephen Gilmore, Obini Izzy, Dylan Drummond, and Chris Smith could all genuinely make the final 53, but I do think if they don't, they're going to make it on the practice squad. They're going to stick around as developmental guys, and they're going to be members of the Detroit Lions for quite a long time. But with all that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. That is my early prediction for the Detroit Lions 2023 defense, special teams, and practice squad. Let me know down in the comments below whether you agree, what positions you would change, what players you'd keep on the roster, and what players you would cut at any given position. I'd be very curious to hear how you guys would construct this roster in contrast to how I would, and I think it'd be very interesting to hear what you guys think this roster should look like going into 2023. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. If you enjoyed the video and you're still sticking around, please make sure you get down below, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on bell notifications so you never miss a Detroit Lions upload. But with all that being said, thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions!